My daughter-in-law told me to pack my bags and spend the summer in an RV park so her parents could take my bedroom. My son sat there and let her say it. I looked at both of them and thought, how did two guests become so comfortable giving orders in my house? I didn't answer right away. I set my coffee mug down on the granite slowly, the way you set something down when you want the sound of it to register before you speak. I looked at Heather, then at my son, and for a moment, I let myself really see them, the two of them, sitting in my kitchen like they had every right in the world to hand me an eviction notice over breakfast. I had lived in this house for 31 years. I raised Julian in it. I watched my husband die in the upstairs bedroom, the same one Heather now wanted to hand over to her parents like it was a hotel room she was upgrading. Every window in that house had a memory behind it. Every creak in the floorboards was one I could place by ear, in the dark, without needing to turn on a single light. And I was being told, over a cup of coffee that had barely had time to cool, that I would be spending the summer in a gravel lot by the bay so two people I'd met 4 times could sleep in my bed. 6 months ago, when Julian first asked if he and Heather could stay with me while their new house finished construction, I said yes without a second thought. That's what mothers do. You don't calculate the cost of helping your child, you just help. Julian had been saving carefully, working steady hours at the accounting firm downtown, and Heather worked remotely for some marketing company whose name I could never quite remember. They'd bought a lot 2 towns over, hired a contractor, and the estimate had been 4 months. 4 months turned into 5, then 6, the way these things always do. Some permit issue with the county, a delay on custom cabinetry Heather had insisted on, a foundation inspection that had to be redone. I didn't mind the extension. I told myself it was nice, actually, having people in the house again after years of it just being me and the sound of the ocean. That first month was fine. Better than fine, if I'm honest. Julian would come down in the mornings and make coffee the way his father used to, strong enough to stand a spoon in, and we'd sit at the island and talk before he left for work. Heather kept mostly to herself in those early weeks, working from the guest room with her laptop and a pair of expensive-looking headphones, emerging around lunchtime for a salad she'd usually eat standing at the counter, scrolling through her phone. I thought, this is manageable. This is what family looks like when it's temporary and everyone respects the arrangement. I want to be honest about something, because I think it matters for understanding how a person ends up where I ended up, sliding open a viewing hatch and telling her own daughter-in-law to get off property. I am not a confrontational person. 30 years as a school librarian will do that to you. Or maybe it selects for people who are already that way. You learn to manage a room full of teenagers without raising your voice, because raising your voice is what loses you the room. You learn that the quiet correction, delivered calmly and held to without wavering, works better than the shouted one. I brought that instinct home with me every day for 3 decades, and I brought it into that kitchen with Julian and Heather too. I thought patience was a virtue that would eventually be recognized and repaid in kind. It was not. Looking back now, I can see the shape of the whole thing, the way you can only see the shape of a wave once it's already broken over you. But at the time, living inside it, each individual moment felt small enough to let go. That's the trick of it, I think. That's how someone like Heather operates, whether she's doing it consciously or not. Nothing she did in those first months was, on its own, a hill worth dying on. It was only in the aggregate, only when I finally sat down one night in October and thought back over the whole 6 months in a single sitting, that I understood how completely the ground had shifted under me. The first thing I noticed, though I didn't register it as a pattern until much later, was how Heather talked about the house. Not your house, the way a polite guest might say it, careful to acknowledge whose roof they were sleeping under. She said the house, as in, the house gets so much better light in the afternoon than our new place will. Or, the house really needs better water pressure in that upstairs bathroom. Small thing, the kind of thing you'd feel foolish bringing up with anyone, let alone your son's wife. But language shapes how a person thinks about ownership, and Heather's language, from almost the beginning, treated the house as a shared resource rather than my home that she was temporarily welcome in. The second thing was the kitchen. I have always kept my spices alphabetized in a rack by the stove, a habit from decades of needing to find things quickly during the 15 minutes I had for dinner, between work and evening errands. One Tuesday in the second month, I came home from the grocery store to find the entire rack reorganized, not alphabetically. By some system Heather had clearly decided made more sense, cooking frequency or cuisine type. I never did figure out the logic. I stood there for a long moment holding a bag of onions, looking at cinnamon where cumin used to be, and I said nothing. I reorganized it back that night after everyone had gone to bed, quietly, the way you might correct a mistake you don't want anyone to know bothered you. She did it again 3 weeks later. This time I didn't fix it. I told myself it wasn't worth the friction, that I could adapt, that a woman who had run a school library through 4 different superintendents and 2 building renovations could certainly handle a spice rack that wasn't alphabetized anymore. Julian, for his part, seemed to exist in a state of determined obliviousness. I don't think he was being deliberately blind. I think, if I'm being fair to my son, he was doing what a lot of people do when they're caught between 2 people they love and don't want to disappoint either one. He simply declined to look too closely at anything that might require him to take a side. When I mentioned the spice rack, lightly, almost as a joke, he laughed and said, "She's just particular about her kitchen stuff, Mom. You know how she gets." As though it were established fact, a known quirk of Heather's, rather than something happening for the first time in a kitchen that had been mine for 3 decades, before Heather had ever stepped foot in it. By the 3rd month, the formal living room, the one with the good reading light and the chair that had been my husband's favorite, had quietly become Heather's home office. It happened through accumulated small occupations. First, her laptop charger, left plugged into the outlet by the window. Then a second monitor, connected to nothing, waiting. Then finally, an actual desk, delivered by 2 men on a Saturday morning while I was at the farmer's market, assembled and positioned by the time I got home, facing the window where my husband used to read the paper every Sunday until his last one. "I hope you don't mind," Heather said, when I stood in the doorway looking at it. "I really need a dedicated workspace for my calls." The guest room echoes. I did mind. I minded quite a lot, actually, in a way that surprised me with its intensity. But I heard myself say, of course that's fine, because that is what 30 years of managing difficult people teaches you to say when you haven't yet decided the fight is worth having. I retreated to the back porch to read after that, even in weather that wasn't especially pleasant for it, because the alternative was reading in a bedroom that had never quite felt like a place for sitting. I mentioned it to Julian once, carefully, the way you test whether ice will hold your weight. "I miss the living room," I said. "I used to read there every evening." "You can still use it," he said, not looking up from his phone. "She's not there all the time. She's there enough that it doesn't feel like it's mine anymore." He looked up then, and for a second I thought he might actually hear me. But then he said, "Mom, she's stressed about the house delays and her new job. Can we not make this a thing right now?" And I understood in that moment that any complaint I raised would be filed under making things a thing, a category that apparently existed specifically to describe a mother expressing discomfort in her own home. I didn't bring it up again for a long time. It was around this time that Heather's parents began visiting. The first visit was brief, a weekend in month 3, and I welcomed them warmly because that is what you do. Frank and Carol seemed pleasant enough on that first trip, if a little reserved, the kind of people who compliment your house in a tone that manages to also imply comparison to something grander they're accustomed to. "It's charming," Carol said, standing in my kitchen, in the specific way people say charming when they mean small. I let it go. You let a lot of things go in the beginning when you're trying to keep peace with people your child has chosen to build a life alongside. The second visit came a month later, then a third. By month 5, Frank and Carol were staying with some regularity, 3 or 4 nights at a stretch, sleeping in the guest room that Heather had started referring to as my parents' room, even when they weren't in it. I noticed the guest towels had been relocated to a drawer in what I still stubbornly called the guest room, but which had functionally become something else, a room held in reserve for people who were not my family in a house that was. By the 6th month, the pattern had accelerated in ways that were harder to ignore, even for someone as determined as I apparently was to avoid conflict. It wasn't one dramatic incident. It was 100 small ones, arriving with enough frequency that I started, almost without meaning to, keeping a kind of mental ledger. Not for any purpose I could have articulated at the time, just the way you count things when you sense, somewhere below conscious thought, that the counting might matter eventually. There was the morning I came downstairs to find my reading chair, the one by the bay window where I'd started every day with tea for as long as I could remember, moved to the corner of the room to make space for what Heather called her morning flow, some combination of stretching and phone calls that apparently required the best light in the house. I stood there in my robe, looking at the empty space where my chair used to be, and Heather, mid-stretch, said without particular urgency, "Oh, I hope that's okay. I just needed more room." It wasn't a question. It was a statement dressed up as a courtesy, the kind that doesn't actually leave space for the answer to be no. There was the Tuesday I discovered that my grocery order, the standing delivery I'd had running every week for 3 years with the same local service, had been modified. Different items. Organic everything, a brand of oat milk I'd never bought in my life, a case of sparkling water that cost 4 times what my usual seltzer did. When I called the service to ask what had happened, the woman on the phone told me the changes had come through my account, made by someone with access to my login. I hadn't given anyone my login. When I asked Heather about it that evening, she said breezily, "Oh, I found your password on that sticky note by the computer." I figured since I was ordering for myself anyway, I'd just add it to the same order, easier than 2 deliveries. She said this as though it were an act of consideration rather than what it actually was, which was helping herself to my account without asking. There was the weekend Frank and Carol arrived unannounced, no warning text, no heads up from Julian, just their rental car in my driveway on a Friday evening when I'd been planning a quiet weekend, alone with a book and a bottle of wine I'd been saving. I came home from an early dinner with a friend to find them already settled in, luggage in the hallway, Carol's reading glasses already on my kitchen counter as though she'd claimed a permanent spot there. "We just decided last minute," Heather explained, when I asked why I hadn't been told. "It's not a big deal, is it? They're basically family." They were not, in fact, basically family. They were my son's in-laws, people I had met perhaps 6 times in 6 months, and the casualness with which Heather had begun deciding, unilaterally, who could show up at my house without notice was starting to feel less like an oversight and more like a philosophy. A belief deeply held even if never stated outright, that the house belonged to whoever needed it most urgently at any given moment, and that ownership, my ownership, 31 years of mortgage payments and property taxes and a roof I'd had replaced twice out of my own savings, was somehow a technicality that shouldn't get in the way of convenience. I mentioned the pattern to Julian once, over dinner, just the 2 of us, Heather out at some work event. I laid it out as gently as I could. The chair, the groceries, the unannounced visits, the living room that had become an office. I told him I understood Heather was under stress with the house delays, but that I needed him to understand how it felt, cumulatively, to watch my own home reshape itself around someone else's preferences without ever being consulted. "I know whose house this is," he said, a little defensively. "I'm not trying to take anything from you. I just need you to meet her halfway sometimes. She's trying." I did not point out that I had been meeting her considerably more than halfway for 6 consecutive months, while she had met me, as far as I could tell, nowhere at all. I let the conversation end there, because I still believed, foolishly perhaps, that patience and reasonableness would eventually be recognized for what they were, rather than simply mistaken for weakness to be pressed against a little further each time. The morning it finally happened, the morning that would end up dividing my life into a clear before and after, started like any other. I woke before 6, the way I always have, made my coffee, and sat at the island with my phone to check the news and the weather. A habit that had survived 30 years of early school mornings, even now that I no longer had anywhere I strictly needed to be by 8. Julian came down around 7 in his work clothes and made himself a coffee beside me, though he was quieter than usual, staring at his own phone in a way that struck me, in hindsight, as someone bracing for something. I didn't think much of it at the time. I assumed it was work stress, a deadline, or a difficult client, the kind of low hum of tension he sometimes carried into a room without saying why. Heather came down at 7:30. She was already dressed, not in the loungewear she usually wore in the mornings before her first video call, but in a tailored trench coat, the kind of outfit that suggested she had somewhere important to be, or wanted to look like she did. She didn't say good morning. She didn't look at the window, at the ocean view that had, on clear mornings like that one, a particular quality of light that I'd spent 30 years falling in love with over and over, coffee in hand, before the rest of the world woke up. She walked directly to the island, set her phone down on the counter with a small, deliberate click, and looked at me. "My parents' flight lands next Friday," she said. "That's nice," I said, still not understanding, in that first moment, that this was the opening line of something rather than a piece of casual information. "How long are they staying this time?" "For the summer," she said. "They're going to need the main suite. Your room." A pause. Bree calculated. "They have joint issues, and the stairs to the guest room aren't manageable for them long term." I set my mug down. I remember the specific sound it made against the granite, a small hollow knock, because I was concentrating very hard on making sure my hand didn't shake as I did it. "I'm sorry," I said. "Say that again." "They need the main suite," Heather repeated with the particular patience of someone explaining something to a person she has already decided is slow to understand. "You'll want to think about where you'll stay for the summer. There's actually a lovely seasonal spot, an RV park right on the bay. I looked into it. It's practically a vacation, honestly, being that close to the water all season." I looked at Julian. He was looking at his laptop screen, which was, I noticed, showing nothing more urgent than his email inbox, scrolled to the top, unmoving. His fingers had gone still on the keys. He did not look up. He did not say a single word. Not in defense of me, not in defense of Heather, not in defense of anyone or anything. He simply sat there, present and absent at once, the way a man sits in a room where a decision has already been made without him, and he has decided that saying nothing is the safest available option. "Julian," I said, and I heard my own voice, quieter than I expected. "Did you know about this?" He glanced up, then, briefly, guiltily, and back down. "We talked about it," he said, to his screen rather than to me. "It's just for the summer, Mom. It's not permanent." Something in me went very still in that moment, a stillness I recognize now as the actual beginning of everything that followed, though at the time it felt more like shock than resolve. I had spent 6 months absorbing small encroachments, telling myself each one was too minor to be worth a fight, that patience was the wiser path, that eventually the pattern would either correct itself or Julian would notice it and intervene on my behalf. And here, finally, was the pattern laid bare in its complete and unmistakable form. My own son, sitting in my kitchen in the house his father's life insurance had paid for, agreeing in advance without consulting me even once that I should vacate my own bedroom for 2 people I barely knew and relocate to a gravel lot for the summer so that his wife's parents could have better stairs. "Did you think about what I said?" Heather asked when I didn't respond right away, an edge of impatience creeping into her voice, as though my silence were an inconvenience rather than the natural response to being told to leave your own bed. "I need to know you'll have your things packed out of the master suite by Thursday. My parents land Friday afternoon, and I want everything ready before we go pick them up." I looked at her for a long moment. I looked at the trench coat, the phone set down with such deliberate care, the practiced patience in her voice, and I understood, with a clarity that surprised me, that this was not a request born of desperation or genuine need. This was a woman who had spent 6 months testing the boundaries of what she could take, methodically, incrementally, and had concluded, based on 6 months of my own accommodating silence, that there was no boundary left to test. She believed, I think genuinely believed, that I would fold, that I had already demonstrated over and over that I would fold. The spice rack, the living room, the reading chair, the grocery order, each one a small experiment in how much I would absorb without pushing back, and each one, in her mind, confirming the hypothesis further. "I heard you," I said, and I made sure my voice was even, calm, the voice I used to use on the loudest classroom in the building when it needed quieting without a single raised syllable. "You've made your position entirely clear." I did not argue with her in that kitchen. I want to be honest about why, because I think it matters. It was not because I agreed, or because I was too shocked to respond, or because I had decided to simply accept what she was proposing. It was because I understood in that moment, standing in my own kitchen with my coffee going cold, that arguing would accomplish nothing. Heather did not see me as someone whose objections carried weight. She saw my quiet as consent, my patience as weakness, my 30 years of careful, considered restraint as evidence that I could be moved incrementally out of my own life if the requests were phrased politely enough and delivered with sufficient confidence. I picked up my keys from the hook by the door. "I have errands to run," I said, and I walked out of my own kitchen, into my own driveway, and got into my own car, and sat there for a full minute before I turned the key, because my hands, despite everything, were not quite steady yet, but by the time I pulled out onto the coastal road, they were. I drove nowhere in particular that morning. I ended up at the small diner near the harbor, the one I used to take Julian to after his Saturday soccer games when he was young young enough that a chocolate milkshake could fix almost anything. I sat in a booth by the window and ordered coffee I didn't really want, just to have a reason to keep sitting there, watching the boats come in, letting my mind settle. By the time I got home that afternoon, Julian was waiting for me in the driveway, alone. Heather's car was gone. She went to get her nails done, he said, before I could ask. Mom, I'm sorry. That was completely out of line this morning. I should have said something in the moment. I didn't, and I'm sorry. I looked at my son, standing there in the driveway with his hands in his pockets, looking younger than his 34 years, and some old maternal instinct in me wanted very badly to simply forgive it, to fold him into a hug and let the whole thing dissolve. But I had spent 6 months forgiving small things, and I recognized, even as the instinct rose in me, that forgiving this one the same way would only teach the same lesson all over again. I don't need an apology for this morning, I said. I need to understand what happens next. I talked to her, he said, after you left. I told her that wasn't okay, that you're not going anywhere, and definitely not to some RV park. I told her if her parents need to stay somewhere, we'll help pay for a hotel nearby. She agreed. She said she overreacted. I wanted to believe him. That's the thing about wanting to believe someone you love. It makes you more susceptible to believing them, not less. And the room? I asked. The main suite? Off the table, Julian said. I promise. Her parents will stay at the Cove Inn. We already looked into rates. For about 4 days it held. Heather was, if not warm, at least civil, greeting me in the mornings. No longer rearranging things in the kitchen. No mention of Friday or the RV park or the main suite. I let myself relax slightly, the way you do after a storm passes, checking the sky more out of habit than real worry. The 5th day, I overheard her on the phone with her mother in the backyard, the sliding door not quite closed all the way, her voice carrying more than she probably realized. I know, Mom. I know, but Julian's being ridiculous about it, she was saying. I told him you and Dad need the main floor because of your knees, and he's acting like I asked for something crazy. His mother's being so precious about her stupid bedroom. It's not like she even uses half this house. A pause, listening. Then, no, I'm handling it. I'm not backing down. She'll come around once she sees we're not going anywhere. She always does. I stood very still in the hallway, coffee mug in hand, absorbing the fact that the 4 days of civility had not been a genuine change of heart. It had been a pause, a recalibration. Heather had not abandoned the plan. She had simply gone quiet about it while she found a different angle, a way around Julian's brief moment of backbone. And in the meantime, she had assessed, correctly as it turned out based on 6 prior months of evidence, that I would eventually come around, the way I always did. That evening, Frank called Julian directly, not Heather, going around her entirely in a way that felt, in hindsight, coordinated rather than accidental. I heard Julian's side of the conversation from the kitchen. No, I understand, Frank. We already talked about this. And then, after a pause, right, no, I hear you, it's just been a lot. And then, longer pause. Okay, let me talk to her again. He hung up and stood in the hallway for a moment before coming to find me. Frank says his knees are actually pretty bad, Julian said. Like medically bad. He showed me a note from his doctor once, I think, or Heather mentioned one. I don't know, Mom. Maybe we should think about a compromise. Like, could they stay in the main suite just while they're actually here, and you'd have your room back the second they leave? I looked at my son and understood with a kind of tired clarity that his 4 days of resolve had already begun eroding under a single phone call from a father-in-law he barely knew. Julian, I said, 4 days ago you told me it was off the table. What changed? Nothing's changed, he said too quickly. I just think there might be a version of this that works for everyone. There is a version that works for everyone, I said. It's the version where your wife's parents stay at the Cove Inn, exactly like you promised me 4 days ago, and I sleep in my own bedroom, in my own house, the way I have for 31 years. He didn't have an answer for that. He just looked at the floor the same way he'd looked at his laptop screen the morning Heather delivered her ultimatum, present in the room and absent from the actual conflict happening in it. I understood, watching him, that whatever resolve he'd found for those 4 days had already been spent, and that the promise he'd made me in the driveway, sincere as it may have felt to him in the moment, was not going to survive sustained pressure from the other direction. I didn't argue further that night. I had already learned what arguing accomplished in that house. Instead, I went upstairs, sat on the edge of my bed, the bed I was apparently still fighting to keep sleeping in, and I made a decision that had nothing to do with Julian's wavering promises or Heather's phone calls or Frank's knees, real or invented. I decided I was done negotiating the terms of my own home. I didn't sleep much that night, but by morning I had a plan, and more importantly, I had the particular calm that comes after a decision has actually been made, rather than merely considered. I drove to the bank first, before Julian or Heather were awake. I moved my personal savings out of the joint household account I'd set up months earlier to cover shared grocery and utility costs, and I canceled the debit card I'd issued to Julian for that purpose. It felt strange, closing off something I'd opened so freely, but it also felt like the first honest thing I'd done in months. From there, I went to see my financial advisor, Patricia, who had managed my late husband's estate and, by extension, most of my own affairs for the better part of a decade. I told her everything. The 6 months of small encroachments, the ultimatum, Julian's brief resolve, and its quiet collapse under a single phone call from Frank. She listened without interrupting, the way good advisors do, and then she pulled up the property records on her screen. The deed is in your name alone, she confirmed. Julian was never added, not even during the years he lived with you before he married. Legally, he and Heather are occupants at your discretion, nothing more. You can ask them to leave with proper notice, and you can control access to the property in the meantime. Locks, alarm codes, any of it. It's entirely your call. I'm not looking to punish anyone, I told her. I just want it to be clear whose house this actually is. Then make it clear, she said. You don't need anyone's permission to do that. My last stop was Arthur's shop, a small storefront 2 streets back from the harbor that had installed and serviced the security hardware for half the houses along our stretch of coast for as long as I could remember. Arthur himself had known Julian since he was a boy, had taught him to fish off the pier one summer when my husband was too sick to do it himself. "Everything all right out there, Helen?" he asked when I told him what I needed. "Thought Julian was staying with you these days." "He is," I said. "That's rather the point. I'd like every exterior door fitted with electronic keypad locks, access restricted to a single code that only I know. Can you manage that by Wednesday?" He studied me for a moment, the way people who have known you a long time sometimes do when they sense something behind a request that you haven't said outright. Then he nodded. "I can be there Wednesday morning 8:30. I'll bring the good deadbolts, not the cheap ones." I thanked him and drove home with a strange lightness in my chest, the specific relief of having finally moved from absorbing a situation to actually addressing it. It wasn't anger exactly that carried me through that day. It was something closer to clarity. 30 years of managing a library full of teenagers had taught me one thing above all else. A boundary you don't enforce isn't a boundary at all. It's a suggestion. And suggestions, I had learned rather late in life, are the first thing people like Heather learn to ignore. Heather noticed the shift in me before she noticed the locks. Tuesday evening, she started stacking her moving boxes in the hallway outside my bedroom door. A silent little escalation. Packing for a summer she still assumed I'd be spending elsewhere. I said nothing about it. I spent that evening instead moving my grandmother's silver, my late husband's letters, and my important documents into the locked cedar chest in my upstairs office, the one room in the house that had always, without exception, remained entirely mine. Arthur's truck pulled into the driveway at 8:30 sharp Wednesday morning, right behind Heather's SUV, which she'd left blocking half the turnaround while she loaded something into the trunk. She came out to the porch when she heard his equipment, forehead already creased with the particular irritation of someone whose morning has been interrupted by something she doesn't yet understand. "What is this?" she asked, looking between Arthur's toolboxes and me. "Why is there a service truck here?" "Arthur's updating the exterior locks," I said, holding the signed work order. She laughed, a short, disbelieving sound. "We don't need new locks. The current ones are fine. Besides, my parents are going to need something simple, an actual key, not some electronic keypad thing. This isn't a decision that requires your input," I said, and I kept my voice level, the way I'd kept it level for 6 months. Except this time, the calm wasn't accommodation. It was resolve. "Arthur, please start with the front door." She turned to Julian, who had just come out onto the porch holding his coffee, still in his undershirt, clearly not expecting to walk into this particular scene before he'd even had breakfast. "Julian, tell your mother this is completely absurd. We're spending money on security hardware when we should be getting the guest room ready." Julian looked at the tools spread across the porch. He looked at Arthur, a man who'd taught him to fish as a boy, and then he looked at me, and something in my face must have told him, finally and unmistakably, that this was not a moment where his usual strategy of quiet neutrality was going to be available to him. "Heather," he said quietly, "just let her do it. It's her house." It wasn't much. It wasn't an apology or a real reckoning with 6 months of looking away. But it was the first time since the morning of the ultimatum that my son had said anything, out loud in front of Heather, that acknowledged the plain fact of whose name was on the deed. Heather stared at him for a long moment, clearly recalibrating, and then turned and walked back into the house without another word, her SUV still blocking the turnaround, Arthur's crew working steadily around it for the rest of the morning. By early afternoon, every exterior door had a new keypad deadbolt, a single master code known only to me, and a temporary restricted code issued to Julian's phone that I had already decided quietly would not remain active past the end of the week. Thursday morning, I asked Julian into my study before he left for work. I laid 2 documents on the desk between us, a copy of the property deed showing my name and my name alone as sole owner, and a formal 30-day notice to vacate, drafted by Patricia's office the previous afternoon. He picked up the notice first, and I watched his hands, not quite steady, as he read through it. "What is this, Mom?" "It's a boundary," I said. "One I should have set 6 months ago and didn't, because I kept believing that being patient and reasonable would eventually be enough on its own. It isn't. It never was going to be." She didn't mean it the way it sounded. He tried, though there was less conviction in it than there had been even 4 days earlier, when he'd first promised me the room was off the table. "She was stressed about her parents, about the house delays, about—" "She meant every word," I said. "And I mean every word of this. You and Heather need to find your own place, Julian. Not for the summer, permanently. This was never meant to be an open-ended arrangement, and it's become one, and I'm ending it." He sat very still for a long moment, the notice in his hands, and I watched something move behind his eyes that I hadn't seen in months, not since before Heather moved in, not since he'd been a young man still capable of surprise at his own choices. "I let this happen," he said finally, quietly, more to himself than to me. "I kept telling myself it was easier to just not push back on anything. I didn't think about what that was costing you until right now, looking at this." "I know," I said, and I found, to my own surprise, that I meant it gently. He was still my son. Discovering the shape of your own complicity, all at once, in a room with your mother, is not a small thing, even when it comes 6 months later than it should have. Recognizing it is a start. He nodded, folded the notice carefully, and left for work without another word. I didn't know, watching him go, whether the recognition would translate into anything by Friday. I had learned over the preceding week not to trust promises made in isolated, quiet moments. I had learned to trust only what happened when the pressure actually arrived. Friday morning, Heather moved through the house with the brisk efficiency of someone executing a plan she still believed was going to succeed. She packed 2 suitcases, made a a final grocery order for a household she was certain would still be under her control by evening, and left for the airport a little before 11, her voice carrying from the driveway on the phone, already narrating the weekend to whoever was listening. Julian came downstairs shortly after, dressed for work but visibly not going anywhere yet, his tie loose. He stopped near the island where I was making toast. Their flight lands at 2, he said. Heather thinks you'll cave once her parents are actually standing at the door. She thinks you won't want to embarrass yourself in front of guests. She's misjudged that rather significantly, I said, setting a plate down on the counter. I told her we should just get them a hotel room, Julian said, looking at the floor. She wouldn't hear it. She said this was about establishing that she doesn't have to ask permission for things in her own home. He paused. Her home. That's what she called it, Mom. Not our home. Not your home she's staying in. Her home. Authority requires ownership, I said. Heather owns nothing here. He nodded slowly, something finally settling behind his eyes that I hadn't quite seen before. Not during the ultimatum, not during his 4 days of resolve, not even Thursday morning with the notice in his hands. He picked up his bag without another word and left for the office. At 11, once Heather's car had cleared the driveway, I revoked the restricted code I'd issued Julian for the week. I gathered Heather's remaining boxes from the hallway, along with her dry cleaning and the morning's grocery delivery, and carried them out to the covered side porch, stacking them on the raised pallets my husband had built years ago to keep things dry. I locked the side door and checked the deadbolt twice. I walked through every room on the main level, reset the thermostats, pulled the curtains open in the living room that had spent months as Heather's office, and let the afternoon light in properly for the first time in a long while. Moved my books back onto the coffee table. At 1:45, I sat down in my armchair with a fresh cup of tea and a novel I'd been meaning to finish, and I waited. I felt, in that hour, none of the things I might have expected. No dread, no rehearsed speech looping in my mind. Just the settled calm of someone who has already made the decision that mattered, and is simply watching the consequences arrive on schedule. At 2 o'clock, I heard tires on the gravel. 2 vehicles. I set my tea down and watched through the window as 4 people climbed out. Heather first, moving with the energy of someone anticipating a victory. Her parents, Frank and Carol, bewildered and travel-worn, clutching their bags. And Julian, expression unreadable from that distance. Heather walked up the front steps first, keying her old code into the new lock with easy confidence. The keypad flashed red. A warning tone sounded. She tried again, harder, punching the numbers. Julian, she snapped, turning back toward the driveway. Your code isn't working either. Try yours. He was already holding his phone, the app open. It's disabled, he said. And then, quieter, mostly to himself, but loud enough that I could hear it clearly through the window. Mom, you were serious. Heather's face shifted from confusion to fury in the space of a few seconds. She turned and began pounding on the heavy oak door with the flat of her hand. Helen, open this door right now. My parents are standing out here. This is completely unacceptable. I set my book down, stood, and walked calmly to the entryway. I pulled back the small brass viewing hatch built into the door and looked out at the 4 people gathered on my porch. Frank and Carol stood a few steps back, exchanging the particular uncomfortable glance of people who have just realized they've been dropped into a situation nobody adequately explained to them. Heather stood closest to the door, her face flushed, one fist still raised as though she meant to strike the wood again. Helen, let us in, she said, her voice climbing toward a register I hadn't heard from her before. You need to leave. I told you my parents were staying here. I looked at her through the narrow gap, and I made sure my voice, when it came, was low and even, the same voice I'd used on countless unruly classrooms over 30 years, the voice that had never once needed to shout to be heard. You spoke those words, Heather, I said, but this house is mine. My name is on the deed. My labor paid for every part of it over 31 years, long before you ever knew my son existed. I decide who enters, and right now, I am deciding that you don't. I paused, letting that land fully before continuing. Your belongings are on the side porch, packed and dry. You and your guests need to leave my property. Frank stepped forward then, a pragmatic-looking man in his 60s who had clearly, in that moment, finally understood something his daughter had either failed to explain or had explained in a version that bore little resemblance to the truth. He put a hand on Heather's arm, pulling her back gently but firmly. Heather, he said, his voice low but carrying real weight, real embarrassment. Is this her house? Is this actually her house? Heather opened her mouth to answer, and for the first time since I'd met her, nothing came out. No quick retort, no practiced smile, no reframing of the situation into something more favorable. She simply stood there, caught between the story she had told her parents and the reality standing on the other side of a locked door. Julian didn't wait for her to find her footing again. He walked past his wife, up the remaining steps, and picked up 2 of the suitcases stacked neatly on the side porch, moving with a decisiveness I hadn't seen from him in the entire 6 months prior. We're going to a hotel, he said, his voice firmer than I had heard it in years, maybe firmer than I had heard it since he was a teenager arguing, uselessly, about a curfew. Heather, pack the rest of it into the trunk. We're not doing this here. Crying now out of what looked like a complicated mixture of fury, humiliation, and something closer to genuine shock, Heather had no real choice but to follow him back down the steps. Frank and Carol trailed after them, Carol reaching out at one point to squeeze her daughter's shoulder. Though whether in comfort or quiet reproach, I honestly couldn't tell from where I stood. Within 20 minutes, the driveway was empty again. The sound of both engines faded down the winding coastal road, and then there was only the wind moving through the pines, and the distant, steady murmur of the tide against the rocks below, exactly the way it had sounded every single evening for 31 years before Heather had ever set foot in that house. I made a fresh pot of tea after they'd gone, and sat back down in my armchair, the house settling into a quiet I hadn't heard in 6 months. The specific specific quiet of rooms that belong entirely to one person again. The afternoon light moved slowly across the floor the way it always had before there were boxes in the hallway and a desk facing my husband's window. I finished the novel I'd started that morning. I didn't think about Heather or Frank and Carol standing bewildered on my porch or the particular sound Julian's voice had made saying we're not doing this here. I simply sat and read and let the tide keep its old rhythm against the rocks below. Around 6, my phone buzzed. A text from Julian. We're at the Cove Inn. Got them a room too. I'm sorry, Mom. I should have done something 6 months ago. I didn't respond right away. Not out of anger, but because I wanted the words to be true when I gave them, not simply comforting. Eventually, I wrote back, what you do next matters more than what you say now. He didn't reply that night, and I didn't expect him to. Some things need to sit for a while before a person can do anything useful with them. 2 weeks later, Julian came by alone during his lunch hour. He stood on the porch rather than asking to come in, a small deference that told me something about where he thought he still stood with me. He told me he and Heather had signed a short-term lease on an apartment in town, and that they'd started marriage counseling, at his insistence rather than hers. I should have stopped her the moment she said it, he said, looking at the new keypad on the door rather than at me. I let it go on for 6 months because it was easier than the conflict. Watching you lock that door on all 4 of them was the first time I actually understood what 6 months of staying quiet had cost you. Recognizing that is a start, Julian, I said. You're always my son, and I love you. But this will always be a house that requires respect to enter. He nodded, hugged me briefly, the way he used to when he was young enough that a hug could still fix most things, and walked back to his car. I watched him go, then turned back into my quiet, sunlit house. The coastal breeze moved through the open windows, carrying the smell of salt and pine the way it always had, and for the first time in 6 months, the air in that house felt entirely, uncomplicatedly mine.